Okay, so good evening. For Erica, it's good afternoon, I believe. Because Erica's coming from California. Okay. This is our Valley Stream Book Club meeting for what month are we? February. I'm so confused. February 2023. Erica Hayasaki is the author of Somewhere Sisters, and I chose that for the book club because it came across my desk and it seemed interesting, a little bit different from what we've really been used to reading. So I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm going to give it to Erica to tell us a little about herself and maybe why she wrote this book and the background. Okay.
And I'm happy to just make this also conversational, so I'm not talking at you too much, but whatever's the most comfortable. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for reading the book. I know it's probably different than other selections that you've had, but I can talk a little bit about it. I am a professor in the literary journalism program at UC Irvine. And so what is literary journalism? It's nonfiction storytelling using journalism techniques, but also drawing from some of the elements that you see in fiction writing. So in nonfiction writing, that's literary journalism, you might have people that are, more fully developed characters, more of a storyline that you're following along, but it's always intended to be factual and reported out. I was a journalist at the LA Times for almost 10 years, covering breaking news and feature stories. And I also write freelance magazine articles. So this is sort of my background, and I'm happy to talk about that because, again, it might feel very different from reading a novel, but there are novelistic approaches that we take in some of our journalism, but again, sticking to the facts. The story that you read today is a true story. 6 years ago, I gave birth to twins, and I have, as I mentioned, been a longtime journalist, but I've always been interested in, identity development, nature versus nurture questions, genetics, and just overall stories about how we become who we are. And so with twins, especially identical twins, there's a whole world of research around studying identical twins and fraternal twins to understand how much of your personality traits, your behavior, who you become, how much of that might be traced back to genes. If you have two identical twins, like my twins, like the twins in this book, and they have the same genes, what can researchers learn about the nature of disease, how each one might react to COVID, for example. There's been studies on that, different conditions, but also different personalities and traits. So knowing a little bit about that background, I met a twin researcher in California, and this was shortly after I had my twins, and just started talking to her about different research that she's been doing around twin studies. She's sort of like the most famous twin study researcher out there right now, Nancy Segal, and she runs a center called the Twin Studies Center at Cal State Fullerton. So I went over there and I did a piece about twins and twin science, and I interviewed a lot of different twins for that piece, which ran in the Atlantic. But she told me about a pair of twins that were born in Vietnam, separated at birth, one adopted by an American family and raised in the Midwest, and the other was raised in a village in Vietnam. And though they had not been together for most of their lives, they were eventually reunited as teenagers. And so automatically, of course, that sounds interesting. You've heard many stories about twins being separated and reunited. But I just became curious about their story and connected to the family to try to learn more. I initially thought that the story would take me into the direction of really digging deeply into twin science more. And it did, in a sense. I learned about, I learned about a lot of things. I learned about sort of the dark history of twin science dating back to, even Nazi Germany, but before that, and how a lot of the research was fueled by a eugenics. Um, and, there's been twins, separated and raised apart and by, strictly to study them, to study their genes. And that's even in more recent years after World War II. So I learned about that, and I also wrote about epigenetics, which is the interplay of the environment on your genes, which is really uh, a bigger part of how we come to understand nature versus nurture. It's not nature versus nurture necessarily, but nature and nurture actually work together, sort of in concert, and there's an interplay between both of these forces. So that is part of the book. But what I really learned over the course of reporting beyond the family stories was about the world of adoption that I did not know a lot about when I started. And that it really started for me with just asking the questions, about how would adoption begin from Vietnam? Like, how do we go back to the beginnings of the first waves of adoptees coming from Vietnam? Of course, that was after the end of the war. But that was one question that I started to learn more about the history of transnational and transracial adoption, but beyond Vietnam, adoptions from Korea, from China, and then in the US, domestic adoption and the history of adoption in the US, and also transracial adoption, whether it was, Native Americans, children being adopted into white families, or Black children being adopted into white families. Some of the history that has been, uncomfortable around adoption and how that's happened, and the conversations that have occurred, and also the forces that have propelled adoption, and also the narratives that we come to understand about adoption through Hollywood or through fiction. A lot of the times, adoption stories begin with the adoption, and then sort of end, when with the child still in the family, but also, sort of on this happy ending. But the adoptees that I talked about how it was much more complex. So that became another thread of the story, a research thread. So in addition to the science thread, which is woven into the book, you have the history of adoption thread. But that is all in between the stories of the people, which probably are, the most compelling for readers. Again, it's nonfiction, so these are real life people who told me their stories, and I spent time interviewing them and getting to know their stories and trying to write them as authentically as possible, and weaving those stories into, into each other's. So you had stories from the people in Vietnam, the family in Vietnam, the family in America, the sisters, and then there was a third sister who was also adopted, along with Isabella. Her name is Isabella, who grew up in America. So there were two non-biological sisters in the orphanage, Lon and New. They were adopted by the same family in America and renamed Isabella and Olivia, and raised in this suburb of Chicago. And then the third sister, Ha, who was raised by her biological aunt and her aunt's partner in a village in Vietnam. And so, of course, they lived their lives, in happy families. They loved their families. They were incredibly loved in both of these situations. In Vietnam, of course, did not have the access to the level of education or privilege or money, for example, that the family in the US did. So there was that very different upbringing. But they both had love, and they both, were pretty content in their families. And the adoptive mother in America discovered there was a twin in Vietnam and set out to find her. And so she spent many years looking for this twin for Isabella's twin. And Isabella was growing up still in the US and had her other siblings and her sister that was adopted with her, the non-biological sister, and was living her life, playing soccer and doing everything. And at some point, the mother does find the sister in Vietnam, and had gone over it initially, as she had recounted to me, thinking maybe, maybe this sister would also be adopted by her, or there would be this reunion. But when she gets there, did realize that it wouldn't be so simple to just move a child who's 13 at that point to America, who had a family and was happy in that family. And so actually their reunion happened when they were 13, but she actually met her younger. She was like 10 or 11. So the sisters were eventually reunited when they were 13. And as reunions usually go on television, you sort of see this tearful reunion on Good Morning America, and everybody's crying, and one of them says, I found the other half of me. And that was not the case in this reunion. It was just a lot more uncomfortable to hear when they recounted it to me. And there were a lot of emotions happening, and that's part of the complexity of adoption that I tried to get at with the story, because a lot of adoptees talk to me about the oversimplification of how adoption narratives are portrayed as sort of reunion stories, happily ever after stories, but reunion can also come with confusion and pain and even trauma. All these different family members that get pulled into a reunion, whether it's the birth mothers, the aunts, the grandma, the other siblings, all of them have their own feelings and confusion and thoughts around this family that was separated through adoption, and now being reunited. So it's very complicated. And the book, I think, tries to get at that complexity with the true stories that I was told, and also the context. And so, you might pick it up thinking you've heard the story of twins being reunited, and certainly there are many stories like that, but this one tried to show the multifaceted reality of that, with the context of the history and the context of the science, but also seeing it from different perspectives. So you'll have the perspective of the birth mother in Vietnam, the grandmother in Vietnam, the sisters in America, the mother, the adoptive mother in the US, and everybody's looking at this same story, but seeing it differently. And so it was important for me to show that from different perspectives. So I've given you a very large overview, and I'm happy to talk about any of this, or reporting, or storytelling, or any of the questions, or adoption, or science. But I would love to hear any questions or thoughts or anything that you might want to bring up, and I can address that too. Yeah, or I can keep talking. Barbara?
I think you did a great job. You did so much research, and you kept us interested, finding out all of the pieces of what was going on with twins, with adoption, with the war, with just being different in the school setting. I know Mike, and especially biracial. I mean, my granddaughters, their mother's from Shanghai, their father is white and Jewish. My friends, they adopted people who were Hispanic and Negro, and all different things kind of happen. And you just put so much in the book and all your notes. Very intense job, and you did it well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for anybody, I am also mixed, and my children are also mixed, and so there's a lot of these different intersections of identity that are not always easy to kind of talk about, the rough patches. There's the beauty of the story, and the beauty of the sisterhood, and the families that love them, and the reunion, even though it is uncomfortable. There's this beautiful reality that the sisters are together, right? And none of that should be discounted. But at the same time, I didn't want to ignore realities of like experiencing racism or feeling out of place because maybe you feel loved in your family, but you go into your school and people don't understand your situation, your family life. They see you as different. So I think I certainly have experienced a lot of that complexity. It doesn't make one or the other the story. It makes it all part of the story. So while I know I was trying to get a lot in there, and trying to make sure that that complexity was represented, I think it's not going to be the tidy novel that maybe we like to read or movie, but I felt like it was more of an honest portrayal that I could, try to do. I don't know if I'm freezing my internet. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
there was a little interruption.
all right.
Did you have to do, you talked about the science. Is that something that you were familiar with, or did you have to do research like to feel up to snuff, to discuss this?
Right. I definitely had to do research. I did a fellowship that allowed me to write about and understand epigenetics, particularly, which is this, clunky word, but and there's a lot to epigenetics. But what I was sort of interested in is particularly the study of what the role of the environment might have on genes. And so if you think of all of us as, we're made up of all these genes, right? Like 20,000 genes. And then you have twins and they are made up the same genes. Like identical twins have the same genes and fraternal twins have like 50% of the same genes like you would with any other sibling, right? But within identical twins, then you would think, well, if we are our genes, then, and we have the same genes with these two people, then they're going to turn out to be the same. But we all know that that's not how it works, right? And you can just look at my twins who might wander in here in a moment because I'm at home and they're in the other room, but they have very different personalities at age 6 and they've never been separated at birth. They've barely been separated for, their lives at all. But they have these individual personalities. And why is that? Well, then you start to get into questions around environmental impacts on genes. So scientists will call that shared environments or non-shared environments. So within a household like this, my twins have, even in this household, sharing a room, they have non-shared environments. They have different books that they've read. We put them in different classrooms. They make different friends, different sports that they might like, games, interests. They like to pick different clothes. They just like to be individual. And we nurture that with them. But they do, even if we didn't, they would go through their life and experience things differently, even if it's down to like how they might choose different foods. Even if in the womb, they're getting nutrients differently. They're not getting exactly the same. All of these little elements of environment can make differences in the genes. The gene can switch on or off. And it's like 20,000 different configurations that you can't always understand it all, how it traces back. But obviously twins will have different personalities based on these, small differences in their genes. Now you take twins who are raised in different countries, speaking different languages. One is Buddhist, the other is Catholic. One is raised as an only child, the other is raised with lots of siblings. One is raised without a lot of resources, the other is raised in an affluent, very well-to-do family. Clearly, they're going to grow up and be very different, and they are. But there are still similarities because they do share those genes, right? So it's not so simple as it's this or it's that. It's, this complex kind of situation. Yeah, was there another question? Sure.
I loved it because it had so much different things that I didn't know about. And one of the things I was fascinated about was the Adoptee Citizenship Act.
Right.
Could you explain that a little more? Did it first come into play 2021?
Well, no, that has so what has happened is that a lot of adoptees, including the two in the book who were adopted to the US, thought their families thought they were citizens. And you know, come to find out they're not, because they're, you know, for various reasons, certain paperwork wasn't filled out. The agencies, the parents, they didn't know. So they will grow up and at a certain age realize maybe they're trying to get their passport or something like that, that they're not citizens. And that is like, what? I've lived my whole life thinking I'm an American citizen. And it turns out there are thousands of adoptees that have been in this boat from this one particular time period, who were adopted during this one particular time period. So that happened to the twins, I'm not the twins, the sisters in the book, the non-biological sisters, because their mother is involved and figured out how to get them citizenship. She did help with that situation, but there have been other adoptees who do not have parents that were proactively trying to get their children's citizenship this late in life. Maybe they didn't have good relationships, whatever that is. Some have been deported. There's a tragic case of a young man who was deported to Korea, to South Korea, where he had no family, didn't speak the language. He already struggled with mental health, and he, you know, committed suicide when he was in Korea. And other situations where people have been separated from their families. So adoptees have been working to change the law, to change this. And when the book was coming out, they had made real strides. The Adoptee Citizenship Act, which would have ensured citizenship for these people who were adopted, was passed as something called America Competes Act. It was sort of tacked onto there. And it looked like it was going to go through. But since the book has been published, it still has not been approved. So unfortunately, I thought that there, you know, when the book came out and it looked like they were headed in the direction of this being sort of all approved as part of the American Competes Act, it has not happened. And so they're continuing to fight for just overall even awareness. I think a lot of people don't know about this, so it's just not seen as a priority. And yet, you know, you can see why it is important for people who've grown up here. Even if you send them to their birth country, they're not going to know people. They're not going to know where to go. They're not going to have their families. They're not going to know the language. There seems to be something very, very wrong about that being allowed, and yet it's still a possibility.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Sure. Irving?
Yes, it's much more complex than you think, because
Yeah.
if you've done adoptions and you've done immigration, you realize most lawyers don't have the background to even handle this that your
True.
book handles. And it's fantastic what you've done with it.
Thank you.
I would think you ought to send it to the judges who have to sit in on adoptions, because they're so biased to begin with when they start as a group, because they're not up it. In other words, they're too old to be handling this problem. And when you're too old, you don't understand what's going on.
Yeah, I just think that the awareness, and you're right, there's not a lot of attorneys that are necessarily versed in how to handle this. It does come under issues of immigration and overall citizenship, and it gets sort of caught in this larger discussion. But this is a very specific population, but it does affect, thousands of adoptees, but still in the overall picture of immigration, that's just a small number, right? And people don't feel moved to make this an issue. except for adoptees who are making this an issue and are really pushing it, right? But and families of adoptees.
And then you have litigated adoptions, which are very interesting because the mother changes her mind half of the time and she leaves the court perplexed on what to do because they want to protect the relationship, but she doesn't follow through. And she leaves the lawyer who handles it because he wrote it as if the lawyer wrote a letter and it automatically got through. A lot more complicated than that, but I don't know how you can do it in a book of this nature. I think you hit so many topics. I think the legal profession ought to start to read this book.
Yeah, I think certainly that what I wanted to make sure people know is that I couldn't cover everything. And in fact, there is a lot of research, scholarly research on adoption, for example, psychology, history, everything you could think of, legal. But, you know, I certainly couldn't get it all into this book, but I did try to include a long bibliography. So hopefully if people are interested, they could start to think about, well, what other books have I missed, or movies, or, you know, academic studies, or maybe I should look up, you know, this organization, Adoptees for Justice, that's working on this, and just sign up to support them, you know, whatever that might be. Because while I couldn't cover everything, I think maybe if people are interested enough to sort of be like, huh, I did not know that. I did not even know that was an issue. I didn't know about all the complexity. I hadn't thought of it that way. Then, you know, they can, if they're curious, they can continue learning. And that was my goal, because I'm not an academic in a sense that you know, sometimes you'll read an academic study and it sort of includes everything you could ever need to know, every single detail, but it's very hard to read. It's very
You do better than that. You awaken the interest in somebody who has gone through it and gone through all of this for 50 years. And I thought it was fantastic the way you handled it, because it gets too complicated to
right.
read. If you are a writer, I don't know how you're going to do it and keep the interest in the book.
Yeah, it does get so complicated. And so when you're doing journalism or the kind of work that I do, and this is for other, sorry about that. This is for other writing too. Maybe novelists do this sometimes, but for me, I have so much research that I have to do. I have to look up all the studies and do all the interviews and read all the books. And at the end of the day, very little will make it into the book, but I have to know it. And so it's sort of like synthesizing the key points as they fit into the narrative. And that's tricky to do, but I do feel like it is important, because a lot of people are not just sitting down to read every academic study that comes out, you know, every day, thousands of academic studies. And they're not going to, because it's very hard. I've tried to read them and they're very, very difficult to figure out what they're saying sometimes. But for me, I can call the researcher and try to find out, what is this about? Like, what are the key points? You know, explain it to me so that I can explain it to readers. But a lot of information gets lost from academics, I think, because there isn't a focus on sort of making it accessible to the reading
You
public.
did a great job, because they don't even do this in law school. And the immigration courses are too flimsy, and there are not many schools that even teach immigration. So the lawyers come out totally ignorant of this whole subject matter. And you hit both subject matters that they're ignorant of, and they're not taught it, and they don't go through it unless they have clients that are forcing them to go through it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, thank you for that. Do you have some background?
I'm no longer practicing, but
Yeah.
I could tell you I had a very complicated issue, and they came and they disturbed me, everybody, because everybody in the public wanted to know that I was wrong, I guess.
Mm,
And then when we finally got finished with it, the court rules had to change it from account of my discussion with the surrogate who actually had to handle it. And I was suggesting to him that he ought to change the rules somewhat because we took away a child from a mother that really should have been kept the child. And she didn't have the legal background because the lawyer who represented her was not qualified to do it. So I think this book has a tremendous value for the legal system to see because you did a great job, I want to tell you. And I don't say that easily.
Well, I appreciate that, especially coming from somebody of your expertise, and that's a really good point that you make. I think that is an issue that is being, considered and investigated and thought of from the domestic and the transnational inter-country adoption practices, like when is a child that's maybe being separated from it, maybe even not their birth mother, but like maybe family that could take care of them and would be willing to, versus sort of being ushered into an adoptive situation that would put them in an entirely new environment. And is that the healthiest environment for each child? It's different for everybody, and it's different on a case-by-case basis, but it's much more complex than sort of making a quick kind of decision that automatically
We
changes.
really help matrimonial lawyers who are completely ignorant of everything.
Yeah. No,
I think this book opens up a lot of issues that you really should think of getting the law schools to look at it to maybe hand out to their students. I don't think you've thought about it, but it covers so much material that a young lawyer is not qualified when he comes out of law school to handle. And then by reading this book, he might understand the complexities of what he's going to go through later on and have to handle.
Yeah.
Erica, I have a question for you. When you approached the sisters and I guess the mothers, the birth mother and the adopted mothers, did you get any resistance? I mean, like, was there one party that was more interested in, or did one of them hold back? They didn't want to open this can of worms.
Well, I think the birth mother was resistant to it. In a sense, later on, she regretted it and didn't want it to be reopened because it was a part of her life that she wanted her kids back, but she couldn't. She realized it was too late. And that's part of the adoption process also that they're going through, and the lawyers ought to be familiar with that, and they ought to, there's another thing, they ought to be equally compensated because the birth mother usually is too poor to get the right representation. And the people that want to adopt it will pay anything to a lawyer to get the child. They'll even go to the point of stealing the child from a hospital. I've seen that already.
Yeah, I got into some of the issues around trafficking of children in the book, but with this particular family, I didn't, the birth mother was not resistant. I think the birth mother has been, there is a relationship there with the adoptive family, and she had always, been very upfront with the fact that she felt like she couldn't give her children the life that she wanted them to have. And so she knew that they had been adopted. She knew their situation, and she was at no point trying to get them back in this particular with the twins. But
well, that is what happens in many of these adoptions, where a mother had a boyfriend, a one-night fling, I'll call it, and all of a sudden their family says get rid of it. And yet the mother is resistant during the process, and then all the forces, the legal forces are overwhelming against the birth mother once the process starts.
Yeah. And I did document
totally unfair.
Yeah, I did document some cases of, for example, after the war in Vietnam, where, a lot of children from Vietnam were put onto a airplane or airplanes, and it's called the airlifts, the airlifts from Vietnam, and they were flown to the U.S. to be adopted, and this was seen as an act of, you know, rescue on behalf of the U.S. And sadly, one of those planes crashed, and a lot of children died. But the planes kept coming, and children kept being adopted. But what people later learned, scholars have documented, and people that have grown up who were part of these airlifts, who tried to find their birth families, and there are no records because records were lost. There were also cases of families and, in fact, birth mothers in Vietnam who came all the way to the U.S. to try to find their children, because they had not intended for them to be adopted. They were put into orphanages as kind of like feeding centers at the time, places where they wanted them to be safe because there's a war happening, and they could not care for them at that moment, but they hadn't intended for them to not be with them forever. So there's one case in the book that a scholar, documents, of a mother coming and actually really finding her son, who was at that time adopted and had gotten to know this family in America, and making a plea to a judge to let the child choose after a certain amount of time. And again, this child had not grown up with the birth mother, but after a significant amount of time, that child actually chose his birth mother, which was it is a notable case. But there's many more situations just from that time period, where there is no reunion story. There is no resolution for adoptees who just want to know, where did I come from? They might not want to go and change their life situation, but they just want to have the option of finding, their birth families. Maybe also for health reasons. You want to know your genetic kind of risks. They're based on your family lineage. There's no record of any of it. They have come to dead end after dead end. They're, in their 50s now and have had no ability to find any family members, because all of this sort of happened so quickly in such a rush. And again, cloaked under this idea of saving children in need, which, was an act of benevolence in a sense, but had completely discounted the birth families, the children who would grow up to have these questions, who would grow up maybe feeling not at home where in America, or out of place, or whatever that might be. So it's a lot more complicated than saving a child from a poor or war-torn country, which is sort of how adoption has been framed in like the fairy tale narratives. And you're right, that the birth parents, don't have a lot of resources to challenge any of this too. So there are groups of adoptees, for example, that are working to give more support to birth mothers and to mothers who, have maybe given their children, relinquished rights to their children who were adopted, but want to have a role in their lives and to support them in some way. But a lot of that's being led also by adoptee groups, adoptees who've grown up.
You've done a good job on that, but a lot of these groups that you talk about are giving the courts cover for what they do, and that bothers me, because the lawyers really extinguish the rights of their clients when they show up and they're poorly supported and don't have a representation and don't do their work. Lawyers are basically lazy and don't want to get paid for work. And that's something that bothers me, because they don't have libraries, they don't do their studying, and they think they ought to just get paid for showing up, even if they're not capable of doing the job.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point there. I mean, there's so many holes within the systems of adoption, from the legal
But you
end.
did it. You hit it paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, and I enjoyed it tremendously. I want to tell you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I thought the documentation was incredible, you know, it was absolutely very interesting. And I finished the book Saturday. And Sunday night, I was invited to, technically, she's my sister-in-law's adopted niece.
Mhm.
I was telling her all about the book. And she's at the point in her life now, she's planning her trip to go back to meet her biological relatives, and she's looking for them.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, she grew up as an only child, and growing up, she always says, "Oh, I wish I had a big family." She would always say this, and we knew she was one of 8 children,
Mm.
particularly. So she's going to. That's what she was talking about Sunday night. I started talking about this book that you wrote.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I also shared it with another friend of mine who has an adopted daughter. You know, she wants to read it. I sent her a photo of the cover of the book. And but anyway, I was telling her, you know, she found the story very interesting.
Mhm.
I ended up telling her quite a bit of the book, you know.
Yeah.
But I thought it was very interesting in your book how they said that the adopted mother, the mother who adopts a child or parents,
Mhm.
should not really be the one seeking out
Mhm.
um, the biological parents when the adopted child reaches a point in their life and they're ready. They should be doing that. And it's interesting because when I told this girl that I had dinner with Sunday night about that comment, she said, absolutely. You know, she's been through counseling and everything.
Yeah.
No. So as soon as I said that, she started shaking her head up and down. She said,
Is that right?
I know. Yeah. So
Interesting.
it was, I was very glad to read that comment, you know. I
Yeah.
thought certain things interesting. Just one thing I want to say, and this is something I thought throughout the book. You know, you start reading this story and we knew that we were told, you know, it was a true story.
Yeah.
So it's like you really want to see and feel the emotions of these children and really understand them, what they went through and their thinking. And what I found very interesting was that a lot of times when there wasn't a strong reaction or a strong emotion, that was all part of their personality. And also, yeah, it was really part of their personality. I thought they both these girls had very similar personalities. It was amazing.
Mhm.
And the, you know, I thought it was so interesting how, because I believe they were twins,
Mhm.
identical twins in one sack.
Yeah.
All right. Which usually makes an even closer bond than identical twins in 2 sacks, I know.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
'cause I have a niece who last year had identical twins in 1 sack.
Yeah.
They'll turn around and they're holding hands.
Yeah.
You know, when they sleep on each other. You know, they're used to
Yeah.
they,
Being
they
so close.
they're used to always being with each other. So I found it very interesting. The girl that was adopted by the American family,
Yeah.
how she really had a very close bond to this girl in the orphanage. And I really thought it had something to do with her being an identical twin, especially growing up in one sack. You know,
Mhm.
she had to replace that missing person,
Mm.
even a body, you know.
Mhm.
But
Interesting. Yeah.
I just, you know, that crossed my mind, you know.
Yeah. No, that's a good point.
My niece in Indiana sends me about 10 to 30 pictures every single day of her identical twins.
Yeah.
And I really, you know, I love it. And it's so interesting. I have so many pictures of them holding hands.
Yeah.
arms around.
I mean, my uncle was a twin. His twin died at birth. And my uncle passed away several years ago, but I do remember talking to him
Yeah.
about how he had, I mean, this is going into a whole different discussion, but he had a heart attack at one point and he coded and he remembered, like, he felt like his twin was there, you know. And he always sort of felt this sort of missing part. And, you know, not every twin will say that though. And these twins didn't say that they felt like they had a missing part of them. But some, I mean, I've had students who've also written about their experiences of having grown up with a twin dying in utero, for example, and feeling a part of me, perhaps a loss there that they never really understand.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot we don't fully understand about the connection, but you can only imagine. I always tell my twins when they fight that they get so mad at each other. And I say, look, you all were one, you know, you were one egg and you split into two. You're the same stuff. Nobody's going to get you the way you get each other, you know, and so you got to get along.
I
And
didn't know you had twins.
yeah, I have 6-year-old twins who are being very good and leaving me alone right now, amazingly. But they fight a lot too, and they butt heads. But I always try to explain how special it is that they have each other, you know, and they're identical too, but not, they're not, you know, they don't seem identical, but they are.
Erica, when was the last time, I'm not sure of the timeline. How long ago was the last time you interviewed the girls?
I haven't interviewed them since the book came out. They, you know, I think that this, well, I will say that there is a moment in the end of the book that I mentioned that the adoptive mother was not happy with the book. And I think it, you know, because I did get into so much of the uncomfortable stories around adoption and this history, which can be dark and disturbing sometimes, and you know, you're not, you know, I think that became a real issue for her at the end of the process, and I know that puts them in a complicated.
But you know, it's fascinating. And I was even telling my niece, the one, you know, she calls me Aunt Lorraine. I'm close to her. The one who's going to start looking for her family.
Mm-hmm.
She was adopted from Honduras. She the first two children adopted in the United States from Honduras. It was the first time. She's about 36 years old, and she was one of the two. But anyway, I got off on a thing. But I was telling her, because you know it was really mentioned in the book quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I said to her, you know, the adoption laws, they've changed so much. You'd be surprised at how primitive they were just 50, 60 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
You know, it's such a different world now. And now with all this DNA and this and that, you know, it's a whole nother world, you know. But
Yeah.
it was a fascinating topic. I was so excited to read this book. I read it very quickly. I couldn't put it down. I read it in less than a week.
Well, thank you. Thank you for reading it.
Oh my God, it's such a good book. It's
I
such a good
appreciate
book.
it. I appreciate it.
So Erica, so the adopted mother wasn't too thrilled. So do you think that you'll be able to like get a sequel or a follow-up, or no?
Well, I mean, the thing is that they've all grown up. So I was capturing a snippet of their lives, which is like their childhood in a sense. The sisters are now in their mid-20s, graduated college, and you know, they're living their lives. And so this, even when I was interviewing, they were sort of like, this is stuff that happened a long time ago and I'm kind of over it. Like I've moved on with my life.
You're trying to write it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like they're moved on, but it was sort of pulling them back into the past a lot. And I think in the past was not always a happy place in terms of talking about reunions and all the things that get complicated, racism, whatever that is. So I wouldn't want to do that again to them. They did it and they went through this process and they were incredibly open. And I know that's not easy, especially when everybody has different perspectives on the same story. You can look at it differently. And I tried to make that point. And I also just hope that I hope that they go out and, they haven't wanted to, partake in like TV things or radio right now, but, talk about their stories and have more adoptees more than anything, I think adoptees should be writing more of these stories themselves and, be out there talking about it. I had the training as a journalist to be able to write about it from a journalistic perspective, but it would be really great to hear more adoptee stories. And there are many out there, but to hear even more that are in the mainstream talking about all of these issues. There's so many that I just touched on,
I have to tell you something very interesting. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
The same sister-in-law, her cousin adopted a daughter. And the girl was from the United States. The girl just met her biological family last year.
Mm-hmm.
This young girl, as a teenager in her 20s or whatever, she was an equestrian. She got into horses and she became an equestrian rider and she went to college for equestrian. And she's like in her early 30s. She met her, she first connected, I think through DNA, like on Ancestry or something, with one of her sisters. She has 3 siblings. Her father passed away a few years ago and her mother's alive. Her mother was always an equestrian rider. What is the chance of that?
Her biological mother.
A biological mother.
Interesting.
And her family.
Genes are powerful,
Her family owns a farm and has all these horses, and they all ride horses together all the time.
Wow.
She was in New York, but now since has moved to Florida. And a few years ago, she bought a horse again. She has a horse at a ranch in Florida. I mean, what is the chance? How many people do you know own their own horse?
Wow.
Don't have been equestrian.
Yeah, I mean, that's what there is this sort of amazing similarities. Like I mentioned, the Jim twins in the book.
Yes.
These twins who were separated at birth and ended up like not too far from each other, and they both married wives that had the same names, and then divorced and married somebody else that had the same name. They named their kid the same, and they named their dog the same, and they had the same, and they never knew of each other until much later in life. And there are, cases that are incredible where it's like, it's got to be the genes. Like, how else could this even happen?
Yeah, it's more like confidence.
But there's also cases where there's not like that. So it's like it's a lot that we can't explain. Like there are similarities with some people, and then there's not with others who, not in the same way.
But I have to wonder though, Erica, that if you take an adopted child and let them be who they want to be, let them follow their own genuine interests, maybe they do become who they are in some genetic forms. Let's face it, some parents can limit their kids on certain things and say, no, you're not doing that. You know what I mean? So, I have to wonder about that too.
I think about that with all of us, though. I think about, we could all sort of look back on our lives. I certainly do. I think if I had made that decision or had not moved here and not met my husband, and then I wouldn't have these kids. I maybe I'd have different kids somewhere else. And maybe if this hadn't happened in my life, then I would have made this other decision. All of these patterns of my life would have changed. And then in the end, would I still be the same person? And maybe I would. maybe there would be slight variations, but the core of me would be the same because it's built in me.
Yeah.
But maybe not, and that's something we just don't know yet, that we don't ultimately know that, but that's sort of the mystery of life, I guess.
It's fascinating though. It's very fascinating. Great subject.
Yeah.
I have to agree, Erica, you cannot explain life. Everyone thinks that they have an answer, but there is something that is unexplainable. That's why we're all unique. Everyone is unique. Everyone's life is never going to be exactly the same. You're always saying, what if that, you open that door, you didn't open this door, and it can make a whole difference in your entire life.
Right.
Yes.
And maybe at the end of the day, your core traits would always be there, but maybe some could be drastically altered, but we'll never know.
Well, we're getting on the hour. I want to thank you so much, Erica, for taking the time to speak to us. I think that, it was a fascinating book for everyone to read, and we enjoy, I know that my book club members seem to really enjoy reaching out and reading different types of books. So this was I think, a very unique book for us. And now, are you writing anything else that we should be keeping an eye on?
I'm writing some magazine articles, but I am not writing another book right now. Although I do have a friend who's coming out with a book from Simon & Schuster. If you want to invite her, it's coming out next month, and she's part of my writing group. She's a journalist. It's called Savannah. It's about missing and murdered Native American women, but it centers on one young woman named Savannah who went missing and was murdered. And so she follows the case, but then talks about these larger issues of missing women. And it's all reported and told in the same sort of narrative style that I do. So if you want to invite her, I can always give you her information.
Oh, please send me it. Okay, that would be great. This is one of the things since the pandemic. We used to meet in person, and since the pandemic, we morphed into the Zooming, and it's been really great because we would never have been able to get authors to come speak to us. Sometimes, yes, we read the book and we discuss it themselves, but I think it adds a lot to our reading enjoyment to have firsthand discussions with authors. So if you can send me her information, that would be great. I would be glad to.
Yeah, her name is Mona Gable, and her book will be out next month. It's an incredible book.
Okay.
I would be all over the place, but I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you.
That'd be great.
That's also a hot topic.
Yeah, it is. It is.
About how crimes against Indigenous women, a lot of times are not investigated. And that's really the premise of the new TV show, Alaska Daily.
Oh, I did not know that. That's interesting.
And that's why I like it. That's why I like it.
I'll have to watch that.
It's the main thing that they're investigating, and
oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and the journalists. It's about the journalists.
Oh wow. Okay.
It's about the journalists, and they bring this really tough lady to Alaska Daily to be a part of investigating this story, because they intimidate anyone, the police and people involved who haven't done the right thing, and whenever anyone tries to investigate or write a story.
Wow.
And this one, and they brought this lady in, and she doesn't take anything from anybody. You know what I mean? So I'm not going to tell you any more about the TV show.
I'll have to read it now. I need things to watch anyway. I don't know what to watch these days, so that's good.
It's on late at like 10 o'clock, I think, on Thursday nights.
Yeah. Well, my friend, she's been covering this for several years now, and she wrote a deep piece about Savannah and has expanded it into this book. But it's certainly an important issue, and she gets into a lot of these complex, hard discussions too.
Like I said, it's a hot topic right now.
Yeah.
Now I've seen it a lot of places.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
Okay, I'm going to end the recording now, and So anyone, let's see, has anything else that they would like